time to get rid of the slums and ghettos of Chicago. Now is the time to make justice a reality all over this nation. Now is the time.
Many people think the civil rights movement started in the 1960s, but in Chicago there was always racial tensions between African American and white communities, as the African Americans had to struggle to live in a country that would discriminate them and treat them like inferiors, as many white people would not even be charged for a crime if it was committed on a black person. By the 1870s there was a glimpse of hope, as blacks could now vote in the United States. As time passed, by 1874 they put a state law forbidding segregated education, and a decade later many African Americans would endorse a sweeping civil right which would give equal rights to everyone. But this really didn't work, as many black Chicagoans still faced discriminatory treatments, as many restaurants and hotels would still turn them away. Despite the civil laws that were on, they really couldn't control it. By as early as the 20th century, white and black races would become more tenser than ever, as it would be the tensest as any generation before. As well as education was far unfair to African Americans, as the average college student would earn much less than the average white high school dropout, and also many jobs would rather consider hiring whites than blacks. Many African Americans also lived in rat-infested slums and low-income environments/neighborhoods, and they paid more taxes than the white people did during a time that they felt they were inferior to the white people. Later, many schools would be segregated. This would give the spark to Martin Luther King to start his civil rights movement in Chicago and change the lives of many normal people and give them a chance to become someone in the world.
Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy. As long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one, we can never be satisfied. As long as I'm not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Works on the Chicago campaign began in the summer of 1965, when civil rights groups invited Martin Luther King to Chicago to demonstrate against de facto segregation, a kind of racial segregation that happens by fact rather than by law, in education, housing, and employment. During the month of June, there were daily marches held against segregation of public schools, as even students would skip school, as some teachers would just turn around to the board on purpose to let those students leave, as they led the great school boycotts of Chicago. Later, Martin Luther King announced plans for a Chicago Freedom Movement, along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC for short, in an attempt to expand the civil rights movement to the northern states. Dr. King worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference because he believed that their nonviolent philosophy could prove essential to remove a system that wants to place thousands of African Americans in a slum environment. Dr. King believed that the SCLC's attention to the North made a good sense because after the Watts riots in Los Angeles, the single largest and costliest rebellion of the civil rights era in August of the previous year, he felt that it was needed to show how nonviolent methods could be used to address the economic exploitation of African Americans in the North. And in late January of 1966, Dr. King and his family moved to a slum Chicago to get closer to the environment African Americans were living through. The Coordinating Council of Community Organization, or CCO for short, organized many nonviolent mass protests in the city and was ready to get involved into further action in the movement. Chicago's politics also made it a good city to start the campaign, as well as it already having an already made movement. The campaign began to gain momentum through demonstration and marches when riots began on the west side of Chicago. Black demonstrators were met with racial hostility while marching through an all-white neighborhood. As they marched, bottles and bricks were thrown at them. Martin Luther King was struck by a rock. Martin Luther King stated that he had never seen anything so hostile and hateful as what he had seen that day. Martin Luther King faced challenges trying to mobilize Chicago's diverse African American community, cautioning against further violence. He worked to fight against the resistance of the working class whites who were worried about the impact of open housing in their neighborhood. On July 10th of 1966, Martin Luther King held a rally at Soldier Field where 75,000 people showed up, making it the city's biggest civil rights rally, where he addressed the inequality in pay, education, job opportunities, and the African American housing environments. He stated problems like how the working class African Americans would be the last hired and first fired in most of their jobs. Later that year, in late August, Martin Luther King met with Mayor Daley, who was eager to end the demonstrations, and both negotiated a summit agreement to build public housing, and the Mortgage Bankers Association allowed to make mortgages available to anyone no matter of their race. After the summit agreement, some SCLC members stayed behind to help with housing programs and voter registration, and Martin Luther King took time off in January to write a book called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, and the movement later ending in early 1967. Even though people still struggled after the movement, many things improved for African Americans, like getting equal and unsegregated education, also getting out of the slums through open housing, which was provided through Martin Luther King's efforts. They also got equal job opportunities in the workforce, who in the past mostly hired whites, but there are still many problems with racism in the United States happening now. For example, many race-infused riots began happening around the country, many due to police cases in which officers allegedly attack innocent African Americans, causing riots in places like Baltimore, Maryland, Ferguson, Missouri, and the Los Angeles riots. And the thing is that many of these are as recent as 2015, so many people think that nothing has changed at all. In all, Martin Luther King played an important role in the influence of the beliefs and views of the people in the Chicago Freedom Movement. Despite all the negativity that many people gave him, he still fought through it and affected other people in influencing them by his actions of nonviolence, like fighting for better living conditions, as well as ending segregation of public schools for African Americans and giving equal education to all. Martin Luther King was also able to get African Americans the chance of equal pay and job opportunity from a system that did not prefer the hiring of blacks. He also improved the living conditions and housing environments for African Americans, which was much better than the old rat-infested, worn-down slums that they used to live in, as this and many other of his actions made people have an influence towards him and to do the same as him later in the future and follow his beliefs and his acts of nonviolence to achieve his goal for others and himself, making him a role model for years to come.